Shamanka by Zachary Barmania. Read for you by the author. Shamanka, Shamanka, where do you lead? Shamanka, Shamanka, lead me astray. Prayers of Tzalka. The column of fire was silver against the glowing sky, the frosty breath of a newborn god. Across the sea, the treetops, many of the refugees thought they heard screaming or chanting, the death throes of heathens. Tzalka walked on. Her feet ached, so did her head and back. She had taken to talking and singing to herself. Is that why Mother chose to keep Kova with her and not me? Is it because I am weak? The caravan had been moving ever since the Pontifex commanded them to leave his monastery. Even as that same monastery rose to the heavens as smoke, Tzalka walked with the others. She had enough moons to walk on her own now, unlike those smaller youths who needed to be carried. At the same time, her legs were too short to keep pace with the grown. She resolved to make the best of this middle ground. Daybreak had come, but nobody seemed to notice. Her feet blistered and bled. Tzalka walked on. There came a time when there was no smoke on the horizon, and her home was truly gone. Beside her slouched a boy, Bari, older than her, yet with the bearing of a child. His eyes darted to Tzalka, then away when she stared back. The girl never stopped looking at the boy once she noticed him. "Who are you?" she asked, but the boy made no reply. "I saw you talking to the Pontifex. What's he like?" The boy stole another tremulous look and said nothing. That night, even the stars gave her strange looks. Tzalka walked on. Elders started collapsing when the sun crested its zenith. They stopped and argued that they must turn back. "Our Pontifex, the gods of sun and moon and star, will never forgive us if we abandon him," one said, though his eyes betrayed the lie. He knew, the same as everyone else knew, that the Pontifex was dead. He knew, the same as everyone else knew, that the gods were dead. Tzalka hadn't known them that long anyway. It was her mom she missed. Dusk fell as Tzalka kicked a pebble. Tzalka walked on. Finally, she stopped, and she was all alone, and the forest was alive with hissing serpents. The pure terror of a child cannot be described. It coursed through her essence. She was taught not to cry beneath the stars, who missed nothing in their sight. This training kneaded the terror deeper into her mind. Could they see into her very heart, where there was no obstacle to hide behind? The Pontifex would know. Mom would know. Where were they? She sobbed into a tree trunk. Ancient birch. All thought and feeling flashed before her eyes, and Tzalka couldn't tell if it was as brief as lightning or constant as the sun. Her breath steadied, moved with the wind. The leaves and branches tossed like mother's hair. Leaves and branches. "Mom, come to me. I'm alone, I'm alone, I'm alone." Had she dreamt it or said it? The night had come alive with fireflies who warmed her. Tzalka had a healing vision, a peaceful sleep. She stretched, stood, and felt the sun on her skin. Her hair had become tangled with twigs, dirt, and birch seeds, like cocoons nestled safely in a bird's nest. A few others were visible to her. Some lay still in the morning dew. "Frost," the inner voice told her, and Tzalka understood with a grown-up's grace. She walked south, away from the sound of an approaching storm. It was still miles away, with long seconds between flash and thunder. She felt this through the touch of her feet on the forest floor, through the taste of rain on her forked tongue. And where she led, others followed. Forest gave way to lapsing shade, and the tall grass of the south. Prayers of Tzalka. Tzalka's followers orbited her, celestial bodies bound to each other in the void. They plodded behind her as she followed game trails towards the thinning of the trees. Pines dominated this part of the forest, filling the air with acrid stillness. Night fell, and her followers stopped to rest their heads on the needled ground. Tzalka walked on, to the edge of the world. Her soul steamed in such a place, hot iron in November air. The doe came to her from the abyss. "Are you my mother? Are you me?" Tzalka awoke, facing away from the fire. She had stopped that night after all, and seen a path move past her in her dreams. The others were talking in whispers about her, wondering after her dream. She let them talk. All she could do was look into the forest, into the teeming darkness. It gave her comfort to know that such darkness wasn't empty. It gave her comfort to know that she was filled by such darkness. The sun rose, and she heard the whispers of the roots beneath the loam. Their language changed as they moved south, from the stern croaks of sentinel pines to the breathy gossip of grass. Eager to join them, she stood and stretched. Tzalka walked on. She is death without violence. She is love without pain. She is life without end. Prayers of Tzalka. The air, once clear with pine, now held traces of something else. Smoke. Had the caravan become lost and gone in some great circle back towards the monastery? The thought passed quickly, for it was impossible. This was some new danger. Tzalka stopped. In time, Bari reached her. "You've stopped," he said, panting as he always did on these journeys. Tzalka said nothing to him. She communed now with her senses, with the mind which stretched outward from her body. Bari took this silence for a rebuke. How strange, she thought, that it was her rebukes, real or imagined, that drew his respect, that commanded his fear. It revealed a lack of perspective. "It's just, people follow you now. We don't know what's happening to you, but you've been a comfort somehow. They call you Shamanka. It's an ancient title, like a Pontifex. You give people hope. I never told anyone this, but the Pontifex gave me an order before... He paused. Bari had never been allowed to speak so long at once before, and he took some time to consider his words. People need to live. They need to survive these times and remember the old ways. We need people who remember the past when we build something new. Tzalka tasted blood in the air, heard the chatter of grown-ups, the language of hunter and hunted. Other hunters entered the forest now, headed towards her and her people. Nobody needs to survive. Nothing needs to be rebuilt. We carry no weapons, we have no warriors among us, and hunters come. At that, Bari stiffened and paled. Tzalka took his hand in her own. You are ruled by fear, Bari. You have died countless times already. I pity it in one so young. That left the boy truly shaken. After a few moments, though, he ran off to warn the others of the danger. She hoped some of them escaped, but to run was not her fate. Tzalka had stopped, and so she would remain until the hunters took her away. Bari scuttled away between the trees. Only a boy, the voice said mournfully. Tzalka looked inward for the source of the voice. Inward, where her soul was quiet as a winter forest. This place was old and familiar. At her back was something cold and absolute, the trunk of the ancient birch. The voice had come from the wood in a whisper, only for her to hear. They call me a Shamanka. What do I call you? Tzalka asked aloud, and the voice never answered. The forest was quiet, but for the crisp ring coming off the cold. Druim, Tzalka said, after a long time in that inner place. Danger clattered towards her in metal clothes, clumsy and imposing. As her awareness rose again, the passage of time reasserted itself in her mind. Mere moments had passed, so Bari was not far at all from this danger. Her choices fell away to a single option, which broke the still forest as a scream, a sustained note that drew the crows overhead from their perches. Moments later, clattering footsteps approached her. Found another one, the soldier said, and he slung Tzalka over his shoulder as if she weighed nothing at all. Druim spoke to her again. You're so young. Birch is the seed is the birch, Tzalka said, and the soldier pretended that he hadn't heard. And the Shamanka turned to the onlookers and spoke unto them. I have brought balance to their souls, which had never known it before. You wanted a leader, a god. Now you have her. Prayers of Tzalka. When they finally removed the bag from her head after several hours, she was in another darkened room. A thin column of sunlight crept its way into the room and exposed some details. It was a shallow cave, and the air was damp and heavy with breath. Slowly, voices rose from the dark. Gods, no. They got her. Sashaya's girl. Our Shamanka. Then she was approached from all sides by other prisoners, and they tried to coax some words from her, to no avail. They asked questions of her. They shook her shoulders and sobbed. Eventually, they covered her in a scratchy blanket and left her be. Tzalka learned much from listening to their hushed conversation. These were the same soldiers who attacked the monastery days before, who now scoured the countryside looking for refugees to capture and eventually sell. At least everyone thought they were being sold, for that explained the steady trickle of prisoners who were led out of the cave every morning. Placing her palm flat against the wall, she reached out to the rock, to the mountain itself. Between the silent, oppressing chaos, she could feel the memory of life. This memory was old, stretching back before the land crept above the sea. Limestone. From Tzalka's fingertips sprouted glowing moss and lichen, a luminescent growth of corals and sponge. Runes appeared and exhaled their spores in golden flakes. She drew creatures and people and scenes. She drew the great birch which loomed in her mind, at her back. She drew her mother, whom she longed to see. Soon the cave was covered, at least as high as she could reach. "Girl," a woman's voice called from the dark. The grown-up tiptoed towards the wall and put Tzalka up on her shoulders. "Draw, magic girl," the woman said, and Tzalka obeyed, smiling. Others began to wake as they reached the zenith of their orbit around the cave. Tzalka drew symbols in forgotten languages, creatures of the air and land, creatures long extinct. When she pressed her fingers in a dot, a flower would bloom, or an ample head of ivy would erupt from the spot. Behind her, some of the people whispered in hushed voices, or gently sobbed at the light and beauty. "It's Sashaya. The girl's drawn her mother here, look." A loud child's whisper came, followed swiftly by a mother's hush. "They're coming! Hide the girl!" someone hissed, giving mere moments to react. Others tried hopelessly to cover her glowing work, to no avail. Tzalka held up a hand to the old man who had tried to step in front of her. "No, let them come. Let them take me." And before anyone could respond, a guard clambered into the cave. He looked around, his eyes slowly adjusting to the light and taking in the view around him. "What's happened here?" he managed after a while. The crowd parted to reveal Tzalka, their Shamanka. Warily, the soldier approached. He tied a long chain around her small wrists, looping it over again and again. "Come," he said, tugging the line and making her stumble forth. The crowd made angry noises and was ready to surge to her defense. "Be still!" Tzalka yelled over the growing tumult, and there was no bloodshed. They led her from the cave, from her garden of living symbols. Druim whispered, "How warm it is in the breath of others." Though muffled by the bag, Tzalka was still able to understand the conversation between her guards. "This is the girl? Scrawny little thing. Metsu is scared of her. Maybe we should be following someone a little bolder." "Who else is there to follow? Myrtis is dead, the whole coup is dead. We're just carrion crows picking for scraps between the ribs. Although, I don't know what kind of scraps she expects to find on these refugees. What would a bunch of monks and nuns have on them?" "I say, if things don't get better in a fortnight, we hit the road, fend for ourselves. We're doing robber work anyway. We might as well see some of the profits." "Enough of that talk, she might hear." A third voice emerged after the creaking of door hinges. It was husky and low, a woman's tone of command. "Prepare the crow cage." They shoved Tzalka through the door. For a while, she simply stood with the bag over her head as the woman, Metsu the guards had said, considered the girl. Tzalka used her other senses to consider in retaliation. She smelt wine on breath, only thinly coating the metallic taste of blood. In time, the bag was lifted gently from her head, sending her hair into a frizzy maelstrom across her face. From between the knots and mats, Tzalka looked up at her captor. Metsu was just a grown-up, aging and bitter. Her armor was intricate but worn out, no doubt matching her mind. The life of a soldier had clearly taken its toll, leaving deep wrinkles in its wake, and wisps of gray in her brown curls. Tears welled in her eyes, something which Tzalka had neither smelt nor expected. "Did they hurt you at all, child?" Metsu asked, her voice softening. Tzalka said nothing. "You know, my men heard stories about you. The prisoners said they followed a Shamanka, an agent of the oldest magic. Now I see these whisperings for what they are, and the truth saddens me. The soldier in me wanted to believe in an enemy, to justify... Well, I see now that desperate people will find a hero, or else conjure one from thin air. I'm sorry for what they did to you, and what I must do to you in response." "She delays," Druim whispered. Still, Tzalka said nothing. "I'm not a slaver," Metsu continued. "I was just doing as instructed. Now my general is dead, our enemy is dead, and I'm in command. What am I to do? I must prevent the bloodshed that would come from them rallying behind you. If order is to be maintained, if we're to survive this great dying that lies ahead, you must be made an example of." "I'm sorry, girl." One of the guards re-entered, letting Tzalka see the cool sky of the early morning outside, still without sun. "The cage is ready," he said, eyeing Tzalka warily. "He nurtures doubts," Druim said. The guards moved to take Tzalka, who finally spoke. "Who is more desperate, those who follow a child, or those who fear one?" Metsu was visibly alarmed to hear such words from a child, and had no response as the guards took the girl away. She spoke in the tongues of the creatures and birds. We could only hear and watch as nature unfolded from her saintly lungs. Prayers of Tzalka. The rolled steel bars of her cage were still dewy in the pre-dawn chill. Before shoving her securely into captivity, the guard grabbed fistfuls of her hair and cut it roughly with his knife. The tangled masses of hair, sap, and seeds fell like autumn leaves from her head, until all that remained was a mangy plain of brown tufts. Tzalka clambered into her cage, and by the might of pulley and chain, she rose slowly into the air. From her perch, she could see everything in the fort, but not beyond the walls. It was a shabby wooden wall built with its back to the mountain. Whatever Metsu said, it sure looked like a slaver's outpost. Cages lined the walls, filled with people. Now they lay on the ground, huddled together for whatever warmth they could share. As dawn came, people began to rouse, and eventually they noticed Tzalka high above them. She could have screamed and drawn all of their gazes, but stoking their fear and rage was sure to provoke rash action. Even without her help, though, the captives grew unruly. "It's a girl up there, just a little girl." A skinny man threw all of his weight against the bars. Why? Why would they do that? Hands reached out and grabbed at whatever guards they could reach. Animals! Had a guard said that, or a prisoner? Tzalka knew that she could die, and up here in time she would. Yet those who were made to watch couldn't bear it. The stoic acceptance that she displayed drove them further into fury. Before midday, they were rioting together against the bars, crying her new name out to her. Shamanka! Shamanka! As the crowd grew more unruly, so too did their captors. Fear drove the guards to their weapons, into their armor, and soon there was an anti-crowd waiting outside the cage. Tzalka could smell the pheromones of human struggle rising through the air like smoke from a raging fire, and it came from the cave too. Her symbols had restored their hope and memory of life, and they heard the violence from without. Even Metsu was drawn into the brewing chaos, emerging from her wooden shelter fully armed and flanked by her officers. There was another among them, a hunched creature which tripped along with the party. As they climbed a raised platform, Tzalka saw clearly that it was Bari with her. But why? It's always the weakest who are hurt, Druim whispered. Tzalka understood the meaning when Bari turned his head up, revealing black eyes and a bleeding mouth. Metsu raised her voice to address the captive mob. You will remain orderly or die. Your Pontifex died along with your gods. You bring forth a new leader, new gods, and they will die too. Death is a fact of life, for you and for your Shamanka. And for you, Druim hissed. The voice within was growing wild like the rest of the crowd. Wildness, in something as old as Druim, was something to be feared, Tzalka knew instinctively. Metsu's words only drove the prisoners further into Fury's arms. As one, they shook the bars, until they began to creak and bend from the strain. Metsu raised her hand, inhaled to issue the kill order. Tzalka opened her mouth, inhaled the same air as her enemy, and sang. Her voice froze the air it touched, howling like a finger drawn over the rim of wet glass. Druim spoke through Tzalka, recalling from her earliest memories, letting the truth flow in all its mutability. Of course, nobody understood. Many raised their hands over their ears to blot out the painful, shrieking note. Others looked up and gaped with awe. And the metal of their swords sprung with lichen. The cage bars bloomed into bamboo or vines, then withered away. From the tangles of her hair rose a young birch tree, surrounded by supplicant ferns and leafy flowers. Up and up it grew, until it was as ancient as the tree where she'd first met Druim. The stone bloomed, the walls bloomed, and the people too. Tzalka watched, aware of what she was doing, and curiously apathetic. They were already dead, Druim screamed through Tzalka's mouth, and nobody understood. Below her, Metsu fell to the ground. From her open mouth, where a scream should have been, flowed flowers of all kinds. Purple hide eaters, a sprig of lover's hand. Her eyes blossomed into devil's paintbrush. From her nose came delicate sheaves of grass. Tzalka felt Druim's empathy for the woman. It is a sweet sort of agony. Even as she sang, Tzalka watched the same fate befall Bari, who had died so many deaths before. Now he died once more, but this time through life. His skin grew soft and damp green, moss. His hair fell away and became algae, or dandelion seeds. His skull became the dark, brittle wood of a pine cone. His skin turned thin and white as birch bark. Once her song ended, it had been many years for their spirits. Tzalka was lowered from her cage. Yet even then she stood above the others who knelt before her. Shamanka, they would say, and now they truly meant it. The fortress looked like it had been empty for decades, reclaimed in totality by nature. Was this the old way or the new? Life spread from that point in all directions, emerging from the womb of inner darkness and stepping cautiously into the cold. Matter, beast, human, God. No longer are they separate. This truth, in time, shall pass into death and smoke.